Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell, and I co-chair the committee responsible for these broadcasts. Today's program will air in March. In 1987, March was officially designated as Women's History Month. But in this year, 2022, the Supreme Court is likely to deny a large proportion of American women the right to terminate a pregnancy. Consequently, in choosing a program for Women's History Month, concerned citizens felt nothing could be more timely than to hear from an expert who could discuss the consequences of this Supreme Court decision for women, their partners, and their children. Our speaker today is Diana Greene Foster, principal investigator of the Turnaway study. This is a research project that studied 1,000 pregnant women seeking abortion, some of whom succeeded and some of whom failed to access the procedure. Over a period of 10 years, Dr. Foster and her team secured information from these women. Their results have produced over 100 journal articles, panels, and presentations, as well as the very readable book, The Turnaway Study. Diana Greene Foster is professor at the University of California Medical School. A California native, she received her BA from UC Berkeley and her MA and PhD from Princeton. Welcome, Diana Greene Foster.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So to begin, please give our viewers some background. What were your motivations in initiating the Turnaway study? And can you tell us a little bit about how you got the project underway?
Yeah, so in around 2007, the Supreme Court had just issued a decision that said that one procedure should be banned on the basis that women come to regret their decision and would be depressed. And when Justice Kennedy was making this decision, he said, you know, though there's no reliable data, it seems reasonable to him to conclude that people would regret their abortions. And really, that's not a strong enough basis to make laws. And not only that, not only was there a lack of reliable data, but if you're going to think that getting an abortion hurts women, then you deny them that abortion, then you have to worry, does not getting a wanted abortion hurt women? So this study aimed to look at those questions. Does abortion hurt women? And how does that compare to not being able to get a wanted abortion? So it took us quite a while to recruit the sample. We recruited over 3 years and followed people for 5 years, looking at their health, their socioeconomic well-being, their mental health, their emotions, and their kind of life aspirations.
Okay, you're moving into recruitment. Could you tell us a little, I'm not sure many of our viewers understand the vast differences across states in terms of abortion policy and how those policies affected your methodology.
Yeah, so it is one of the most active areas of law on a state level is passing restrictions on abortion. So there have been hundreds of restrictions, I think 600 since, I don't know, 600 recently, just an insane number of restrictions on abortion. And these regulate everything from physical aspects of the provider to decision-making for the woman to how long people have to wait before they can get a procedure, what information they're told when they arrive. Some states have gestational limits that actually say if you're beyond X weeks of pregnancy, you can't have an abortion anymore. And some just make it really difficult to operate a clinic. And so those clinics shut down. And as a result, the number of abortion providers, the number of clinics has dramatically gone down over time. Abortion rates have also gone down since their peak in the 1990s. And in many states, it's either a state gestational ban or there's no provider who's trained and able to go beyond a certain limit. And so in that whole state, you can't get an abortion beyond, say, 18 weeks or 20 weeks. So this study uses that fact that there's a gestational limit to abortion to, ideally from a science perspective, we would randomize people to getting an abortion or not. In fact, we would blindly, we would make it so that they didn't know whether they got the abortion or not. Clearly, neither of those is morally or practically feasible. And so instead we use these gestational limits. So those who were over the gestational limit were denied. Those who were just under the gestational limit and received are the comparison groups. But because the state and clinic limits vary so much, we could have somebody who was denied an abortion in, say, Fargo, North Dakota, at the same gestation that they would have received the abortion had they only been in Dallas, Texas, or some other place. So, so we ended up with quite a wide range of gestations and people who received or were denied in abortions. And the important thing about recruiting on either side of the limit is what we wanted was the two groups to be as similar as possible at the point they were seeking abortion, so that when we looked at their outcomes over time, we could say, well, this is because one group received that abortion and the other group didn't.
Well, okay, so tell us a little bit more about the recruitment, because you have to make some kind of pitch, and probably not everyone accepts. And did you offer them any compensation? And nowadays, it's difficult to get people to cooperate for scientific research.
Yes. So we have the point person at the clinic say, do whatever counseling they would normally do. So we didn't want to interfere with their clinical care at all. But then the point person, when they were done all that, would say, there's a study you might be interested in. Here's a little bit about it. And they had a little flyer. If you're interested, I can put you on the phone with researchers in California. And then we would guide the person through the informed consent process. And the person could decide to participate or not to participate. And usually they decided, people tend to say no before we ever got on the phone with them. And nearly everyone we got on the phone with was eligible. Our eligibility criteria were that you were in a certain, that you were received or were denied. And there weren't, many people were ineligible, but not everyone agrees to be called every 6 months for 5 years. I know that's shocking. You'd think, of course, everyone would want to be called. And our participation rate was about 37%, and it is completely in line with other longitudinal studies, but it does raise the possibility that somehow we got a sample that was different. And there are a couple ways that we've checked to see whether we got a skewed sample. One way is that we look at the demographics of the people in the study compared to the people who seek abortions nationally. And one way in which we differ is that the women in our study were disproportionately later in pregnancy, because that's the criteria for recruitment. So they were later in pregnancy, but on most demographic and mental health criteria, they're the same as people who seek abortions nationally. So it was a nice representative sample. We can also check whether it's also possible that the people who are uncomfortable with abortion are less likely to say yes. But I've done studies where I recruit everyone in a waiting room anonymously. So everyone, and I've also done studies where I just abstract medical records. So there's no loss, everyone is in it. And on those studies, we find very similar rates of anticipating poor coping with the abortion. So I think our sample is actually very strong.
Well, as I think I've already said to you, I think that unless you can make an argument that the women who declined, who had abortions, were different from the women who declined and didn't have abortions, which I cannot see would be the case, that what you're doing is comparing those women who differ in the same way from those
Yes.
who didn't. And therefore, I think that you're on pretty solid ground. What I am interested in, however, is how then, on what parameters did the women who succeeded and the women who didn't succeed differ over and above? I mean, before
Yes.
we're talking about measuring the effect of the abortion.
Yeah, so just to rephrase what you're saying, how did people who got their abortions differ from those who were just a few weeks later and were denied? And there are two areas of difference. One was age, and the other was some economic disadvantage. And the reason for those differences are that the reason for the age difference is that people who are young are less likely to realize they're pregnant. They're slightly slower to recognize they're pregnant, and that affects their timeliness to get to a clinic. So the people who are denied were disproportionately young, and that's something we can just control for in the analysis. It's not hard to adjust for that. And the other is that people who have very few economic resources are also slowed down. It's harder to travel, it's harder to get to a clinic, it's hard to pay for the procedure, and so people are slowed down, and we also control for those baseline differences.
Okay, didn't find differences with respect to income or partnership status or anything like that?
Not partnership status, but income, yes. As I said, they're less likely to be full-time employed.
Oh, well, yeah, okay. Okay. You just mentioned something that again, I learned a lot about from the book that I didn't know about, which has to do with the phenomenon of discovering a pregnancy. Could you talk a little bit more, not only about, about how and why do you think there is such a variation? Do you think that it has some other implications over and above? What does it mean to a person to discover, later that they're pregnant?
Yeah, I think I went into this thinking that, wow, you really must be a mess if you don't realize you're pregnant. Like, there was some part of me that was ready to be judgmental. And what I learned from this study is that is not founded. That when you look at people's experience with pregnancy, there's just a huge variation in people's physiological response. So for example, you probably know some people who threw up their entire first trimester, and you know other people who felt good as gold the entire time, and you wouldn't say, oh, the people who felt good, man, something's wrong with them. But if you do feel good through early pregnancy, you're much less likely to realize you're pregnant. So that's one, is just the huge physiological difference in how people react to pregnancy. And some people just don't have symptoms. And the other thing is that we find statistically that people are slower to recognize they're pregnant if they were using contraception in the month they became pregnant. So people who were using pills, using condoms, they thought they were protected, and so they're slower to recognize that in fact they're pregnant. So
this is a good moment to ask you to talk a little bit about that people believe that if they're taking the pill or their partner's using a condom, that they're not going to get pregnant, but you didn't find that.
Well, note that I have a sample of people who did become pregnant.
Right. Well, that's true.
People who skipped a condom, who missed some pills and didn't get pregnant. But of the, people, contraceptives are effective, but people are using them for 30 years of their life trying to avert a pregnancy. And unless something is perfect, some people will become pregnant, and no contraceptive is perfect. So my sample absolutely is skewed towards the people who either were terrible contraceptors or were really unlucky. And even among the people who weren't in the study, who never got pregnant, there are plenty of terrible contraceptors. You know, it is not rare to be sloppy with contraception. People, the risk of conception for any act of sex is pretty low. And so people are just not, you know, it's like crossing the street, you know, you look both ways quickly and you go, you know, it's not, it's, I don't think we can be super judgmental with people who aren't perfect contraceptors.
Well, I thought, you know, if you read the book, which I would encourage our viewers to do, you will get a much more sympathetic picture. And in fact, if you had no unwanted pregnancies, as I never had an unwanted pregnancy, you will be grateful. Thank your lucky stars, because I do think actually the probability is rather higher than you might imagine. It's not like, you know, you're punished for being bad. You can be quite good and still get pregnant.
And the chance of any one act ending in pregnancy is pretty low. So people can have a sense that it's low and can be not super careful. And it's a lifetime of not being perfectly careful that really increases the risk.
For sure. Right. Okay. Before we get to the results, I am a kind of a methods freak. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you have. First of all, you're talking a little bit like about the phone. So did you do any in-person interviews, or how did you get the information? And what kinds of information did you seek from your respondents?
So we had a team of very highly trained interviewers who did guided interviews on the computer, where the most of the questions were multiple choice or numbers that the person would reveal. And some of the questions were just open-ended and the person could say whatever they wanted, and those poor interviewers had to type it in. So it was all on the phone, and the questions were guided through a computer in California. So yeah, so that we didn't do any in-person interviews. At the very end of collecting, we did over 7,700 phone interviews over 8 years of collecting data, or maybe 9. And then at the end of that, we did, my colleague Heather Gould called a random 25 people and asked them, could they please tell their story in their own words? So no guided interview, just prompts like, what was going on in your life at the time when you started the study? What was, you know, what did you think when? How did you make this decision? And so it was actually the basis of her interviews that form the stories that are in the book. So there are 10 in the book. We profiled 10 women with the stories of their experience in their own words, so that not everything is filtered through the study. Some of it is pretty directly women telling you what it's like to be late in discovering you're pregnant, to be turned away, or or alternatively to receive an abortion and move on.
Right. And well, I think that is a real strength of the book, that many people really like to follow the experience of a given person for, you know, a few minutes, not just read numbers or even just one sentence quotes. We actually had a program which is ongoing right now in our community, where there's a performance, and it's actors who are reading real scripts of women who had experienced abortion and talk about it. And we're showing that now, actually. So, yeah, well, it's March, and we're all, many of us know that March is the time that women really need to get their act together and remember where we were and worry about whether we're going there again. Okay, so I think maybe not everyone is a methods freak, so why don't we move a little bit to what you found? And I don't know where you want to start. You want to start with mental health or physical health? What was the difference between the women who did and did not succeed in accessing that abortion?
Yes. So first I'll answer the question, does abortion hurt women? And we looked at mental health over time and find no difference, no evidence that abortion is associated with worse mental health outcomes. And we looked at a plethora of mental health outcomes. In fact, we didn't see a difference between the people who received abortions and people who were denied abortions in depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, suicidality over time. Initially, the people who were denied abortions had worse mental health. Immediately upon being denied, they had higher anxiety, lower self-esteem, lower life satisfaction. And that's because they've just been denied an abortion and they're madly trying to figure out how to make things work. And you could say, oh, both groups are the same because they're both doing terribly, but you would be wrong. In fact, both groups improve over time. And the levels of depression and anxiety are not unusual at all. They're in fact lower than I often feel. So people are very emotionally resilient, and this is not, abortion should not be a mental health, is not primarily a mental health issue, but there were huge differences in physical health outcomes and in socioeconomic outcomes. So
Wait, just one sec, Diana, before you move to that, do you have any information about the social context of your subjects? By which I mean, clearly what the book makes very clear that in the long term, there are no mental health effects, so to speak. I mean, people actually get over it and they forget about it. They're not spending their life obsessing about the fact that they'd had an abortion. But I was wondering if there might be some difference depending on the kind of community in which people lived, and in particular, if people were living in a social context that was very condemnatory.
Yes. So you've absolutely hit on one of the findings, which is that there's some evidence of worse mental health outcomes among people who report very high abortion stigma. So we asked questions about who they told, and also whether people close to them would look down on them if they know they'd sought an abortion, or whether people in their community. And those stigma questions are somewhat associated with worse mental health, but it's not a huge difference because I think their whole context of their lives so outweighs this one event. I don't think people, once they have an abortion, their identity is abortion person. I think they move on. So it's not a huge effect, but it is there. And but mostly people are extremely resilient. And the most famous statistic from the study is that 95% of people who have abortions say it was the right decision for them. So it still leaves 1 in 20 who maybe don't feel like it was the right decision, but that's nowhere near what probably many people think because our whole social commentary around abortion is so infused with stigma that people imagine it's a much worse event than it is.
Well, right, and actually, I think that's been increasing over time. The amount of stigma, the kind of uproar around this, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, there wasn't opposition like there is now, and people were not. But then you're studying it now, and this is really when you should be studying it, because this is when it's most likely if it's going to have consequences. So tell us then about the physical, which is where the real action is.
Yeah, so physical health and socioeconomic consequences, there are huge differences between people who receive abortions and people who don't. I think we grossly underestimate the physical health risk associated with pregnancy and childbirth. And we actually had 2 women in the study die of childbirth and pregnancy related causes in the study. So there is, that's an astronomically high level of maternal mortality. And it's a strong indicator of how risky pregnancy is. And we take it for granted. People get pregnant all the time. They're willing to take this risk when they want a child. But to take this risk when you don't want a child is huge. It's and I know our Supreme Court Justice Coney Barrett just, was very cavalier about this, but we shouldn't take the sacrifices that women make for granted and think that this is a trivial experience to be pregnant and deliver a child.
What did Justice Barrett say? I'm not.
The problem of abortion is easily rectified by just allowing people to place their child at safe havens like firehouses and police stations and to be placed for adoption.
Well,
There's
let's come back to that later. Okay.
yeah, there's
right.
a lot wrong with that. So very large physical health differences, not just in the complications from childbirth, but long-term physical health differences in increased hypertension and more chronic pain, and just a rating of worse health for years later. So it's not just the end of pregnancy, pregnancy changes your body in a way that lasts for the rest of your life, truthfully, although we only follow people for 5 years. You can tell from, you go into the doctor's office in your 50s or your 80s, and they'll ask you about your childbearing because it is some of the symptoms you're having. So anyway, so huge physical health differences in economic well-being, where we see that people who are denied and carry the pregnancy to term are much more likely to be below the poverty level, more likely to not have enough money for basic living needs. And this economic harm redounds onto their existing children. So people often say, the reason I want to have an abortion is to take care of the kids I already have. And we see that they are less able to take care of those existing children, and the existing children do worse if their mom is denied an abortion compared to their mom receives the abortion.
Do you have any idea what percentage, if we extrapolate from your saying, what percentage of women who receive abortions are single moms already?
I don't have the single, I have the moms. So 60% of people who have abortions are mothers already.
60.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. So it's not the teenage oversexed, hypersexed girl that gets into trouble. It's actually someone who's got to worry about taking care of other children.
Yes. And I wouldn't say, yeah, and not endorsing the concept of people being oversexed, but so yeah, and so then the other area is kind of achievement of aspirational goals. We asked everyone at the end of each interview, what do you hope to achieve in the next year? And how do you think your life will be different in the next year, in the next 5 years? And we see that women who are denied abortions are less likely to set aspirational plans for the coming years. So that's, it shows you that this abortion is mostly an issue that affects women in their 20s. And these are the years when they're planning out their lives. They're figuring out school, they're figuring out relationships, they're figuring out careers. And a pregnancy, when they're not ready to have a pregnancy, affects the trajectory in all those areas.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. What about then going back to this point that 60% of them are mothers, you also looked at the consequences for the existing children, yes?
Yeah, so we asked women about whether their child could achieve developmental milestones. So these were questions developed for a pediatrician's office around 6 areas of developmental development. So gross motor, fine motor, receptive language, expressive language, self-help, and social emotional. So that's 6. And we looked at, can your kid achieve the developmental milestone for your kid's age? And when we apply those questions, we see that women who are denied abortions, their children are slightly less likely to achieve those developmental milestones.
The child, are we distinguishing between the child that might have been aborted and the remaining and the previous children?
So that's another set of kids, is the child born because the abortion was denied, compared to the next child born to women who received an abortion and chose to have a baby within the study period. So we call that second analysis, the children born from the pregnancy that the woman wanted to have an abortion compared to the next child. When we compare those 2 sets of kids, and really, if you want to think about this is like, what are the benefits to the kid if the woman has control over the timing of the birth? And what we see there are economic differences, that the child born subsequently is less likely to be raised with economic hardship. And also with the child, the woman reports better maternal bonding with the child born where she had control over the timing and circumstances. So there's maternal bonding differences as well.
Right. Now, is this the right time to ask you to mention something about the Prague study, which I heard you mention in a talk you gave it elsewhere, which
Yeah,
is
so
one of the few studies that predates your study and shed some light on this business of the children that were born anyway?
Yeah, this is an incredible study led by the sociologist Henry David, and he with Czech colleagues followed people who in 1961 or 61, 62, there was a policy that you could get an abortion if a hospital committee said you could have it. So this group of scientists recruited, noted the people who were twice denied by those committees and therefore had a baby when they wanted to have an abortion, and their children compared to children born at the hospital at the same time, and matched by some kind of demographics. And because this is the Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia, they were actually able to track these children for 35 years through public records, which is incredible. I thought my 5 years of following people was an achievement. That's nothing compared to 35 years. And so, but he had access, he wasn't interviewing them. He wasn't asking them how they felt. He was looking at things like inpatient psychiatric care, criminal records, that kind of thing. And what he found was that, and he called them born unwanted. I don't love that term because when I talk to women, they don't say their child is unwanted. The pregnancy was unwanted, but they're mostly resilient. And by the time the child is born, they chose to parent. They don't even choose to place a child for adoption. So I wouldn't say it's accurate, born unwanted, but in any case, the children who he says are born unwanted are much more likely to suffer from mental health and criminal issues, as particularly the boys born.
Well, I think that's absolutely fascinating. And, you know, from my own perspective, I find that this is really very hard data. That is to say, this isn't what the mother reported. This is what actually happened to these people over the life course. And it's statistically different and less satisfactory. I think that's amazing. But you actually, in your study, were able to very cleverly use one piece of hard data, and that was the credit records. Could you tell us a little bit about how you used those and what you learned from them?
Yeah, but I want to push back a little on the hard data terminology. Asking people about their own experiences is really important. And there are things you can get about people's feelings and experiences that you don't get from medical records. And if we care about people's well-being, we actually have to talk to them and ask them what their experience is. So I think they're both important for different reasons, but
Sure.
I'm glad we have both. When I published a paper about the economic outcomes in the American Journal of Public Health, a professor from the University of Michigan reached out to me, Sarah Miller, who's an economist, and said, what you really should do with your data is you should link it to credit records. So whenever you open a credit card or you declare bankruptcy or you have a lot of debt, the credit agencies are keeping track so that they know whether to give you another credit card, whatever. I don't know what all their purpose is for these credit records, but every public record of your economic well-being is going to these credit agencies, and they're giving you a credit score and keeping track of these public things that happen to you, like evictions and bankruptcies. And the nice thing about them is that archived credit reports go back for years. So we actually could take the people who between 2008 and 2010 had a pregnancy that they either had an abortion or they had a birth, and follow them, look back 3 years even before that pregnancy, and then 5 years after. And there's no loss to follow up in this data because it didn't rely on my interviewers reaching them. And it was 3 years before they even became pregnant. And what we see there is that the economic well-being of the people just over the limit, just under the limit, are nearly exactly the same for the 3 years leading up to the pregnancy. And at the point where one group gets an abortion, the other one is denied, you see this diverging and they never catch up. There's so you see it in the amount of debt they're carrying, you see it in their bankruptcies and evictions. And Sarah Miller and her colleague, Laura Wary, who was then at UCLA and is now at NYU, did this analysis, and they found that it's the impact of being denied an abortion is similar to a hurricane hitting your house. So it's huge.
I think that's just spectacular, and it's extremely important. I mean, we do, of course, have to recognize that the policy is no longer proceeding in a rational manner, but this is really overwhelming evidence. Okay, before we talk a little bit more about politics, I would like you to speak to Justice Barrett's point. You did look a little bit. What can you tell us about adoption as the kind of solution for unwanted pregnancy?
Yeah. So my colleague Gretchen Sisson, who's this whole endeavor has been a massive collaboration of scientists. In fact, all women scientists from different disciplines working together to answer pieces of it. So my colleague Gretchen Sisson, who's a sociologist, looked at what people said about adoption and their plans for adoption and what they were thinking about it. And initially, I think about 15% of people who were going to be denied an abortion said that they were considering adoption, but by that time they delivered, only 9% actually placed for adoption. And when you ask people about it, they say that would be way too hard. It would be way too hard to place a child for adoption. When we did these follow-up interviews with people, we intentionally tried to get all the people who did place for adoption to hear more about that experience. And of the 2 people that we got, they had both become pregnant again with unwanted pregnancies in the study period. And one of them, for that subsequent pregnancy, opted for abortion, and the other one opted to parent. Neither opted to again place for adoption. I think to assume that somehow this was an easy thing to do is really callous. People do it when there are some people who become pregnant and know immediately they want to place for adoption. They're not in my study. I don't know much about that experience. People who want an abortion, adoption is not the right solution for them if what they've chosen is abortion.
That's an excellent point, actually. I hadn't thought of that. So in a sense, your strategy doesn't allow shed too much light on that. Although, my own experience back when I was a social worker, I would also suspect that more of this, the adoption is putting your child up is more common among a woman who has no children. So you haven't gotten any children, and if you decide to carry to term, you may be able to kind of resume your life somewhat as it was if you give up the child. Once you already have children, it would seem to me giving up a child for adoption would be a very unpopular, very unlikely response. And
one woman did tell us that she didn't know how she could explain it to her other children.
Right. Yeah. Right. There you go. Right. And guilt laden. Right. Okay, let's move forward a little bit. I wanted, let's admit that information is not really what the world is responding to here. So abortion restrictions are getting tighter and tighter. The first thing I wondered if you would talk a little bit about, because you did research on that, is this business about harassment. And I'll just say someone in my family did have an abortion. And this was many years ago, and the harassment was unbelievable. There were just lines of people, and I remember actually paying attention to the fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in one of her decisions, strongly supported the right that people had the right to express their views, and but actually, if you observe the kinds of the way these people act, this is not simply a matter of objecting. It's a matter of humiliating, insulting, vile, horrible things are said and threats to people. And yet, what can you tell us about the people that go through that?
So first I have to say that the study didn't include anybody who looked at the protesters and got in their car and gave up. So this is only people who made it through the lines of protesters. And some sites had no protesters and other sites had very aggressive protesters. So that's kind of situation allows us to look at how the difference in interactions with protesters affects people's feelings. And one thing I can say is that between the people who saw no protesters to heard protesters, saw them but didn't hear them, heard them and saw them, and then were physically or verbally tried to be stopped by a protester. So that's the spectrum. We see that the more contact they have with the protester, the more upset they are. But if you ask them about their feelings about the abortion 2 weeks later, there's no difference in how they feel about the abortion based on how much contact they had with the protester. So the people who were, where a protester actually tried to stop them from entering, the people who were yelled at compared to the people who had no contact at all, no difference in the chance that they feel regret about their abortion, that they feel anger or sadness or happiness, any of it. So if I were a protester, I might give up. At least, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I guess they're not trying to necessarily make people sad, but they're not having an effect on how people feel about their abortion. Maybe they're keeping some people from going in the clinic. I don't know. But protesters don't seem to have a long-term effect, although they are very upsetting to people. And I also note that the clinics have to do quite a lot to calm people down after they've been harassed. So the reason I don't see a difference might be because at the clinics with very aggressive protesters, someone's having to spend quite a long time with the patients to make them feel okay. I don't know.
Right, and so then it may vary also how
It
good those people are.
Be more a marker of the success of the counselors than
right.
of the futility of the protesters.
Right. Okay, and so then what in many states, again, this does vary, assuming that the woman survives the protesters, doesn't get in her car, as you say. Could you talk a little bit about the other barriers? I mean, you discuss this in your book, but I did also want to mention that in yesterday's New York Times, that's on February 15th, there was a very long article. This is a very hot topic right now about the ways that states dissuade people and the extent to which women are subjected actually to false information. And I wondered if you could talk about what you found in terms of the kinds of false information that abortion seekers are confronted with.
So some states mandate that someone at the clinic give people a pamphlet or a speech about the harms of abortion. And most of that is not factually based. So when we ask people about how they feel about their abortion, we also ask, did anyone counsel you at the clinic? Did they counsel you to have an abortion? Did they counsel you to not have the abortion? Did they say it was up to you to decide? And did you find the counseling that you got helpful? So interesting to note, almost nobody says that they were told to have the abortion. People say that the counselor let them decide. A few people saying they were dissuaded from, that the counselor tried to talk them out of it, but very rarely. But when we ask how helpful the counseling is much less likely to be helpful in the states where the state has mandated what the counselor says to the woman. So when the counselor is required to give a big list of misinformation, the woman says that counseling was less helpful.
I see. And did you also mention they have they do have to have ultrasounds that they have to look at? Or
So
are there
some states, there's also a big range. Some states mandate that the woman be offered an ultrasound. We had no states where the woman was mandated to actually look at the ultrasound. So what we find is that even in the states without those mandatory ultrasound viewing laws, some clinics choose to offer the view. So we have states where the clinician, the technician decides who to offer a view to, and some where the technician is required to offer a view to everybody. What we find is that when the technician has the authority to decide who to offer it to, they tend to offer it to people who are more likely to say yes and who find it more helpful. And who it is who opts to view are young people who've never been pregnant before. And you can see how that could be. People who've become pregnant before, who've been pregnant, know exactly what it looks like. But people who haven't are super curious, and for them, it might help to understand what pregnancy looks like. So those people who opted to view tended to find it helpful. Not everybody found that it made them sad. Some people said that it actually made them feel happy and more content with their decision.
I haven't mentioned this before, but I just wonder, now you're describing what to me is sort of a major difference among states. And we talked earlier about the fact that different states have different cutoffs, which of course we'll talk in a sec that may change altogether. But would you be able to tell us name some of the states to give us some kind of better picture of, well, which are the states that have offering the ultrasounds and the false information, or do you feel there's not really that much difference, or which are the states where the wait is really long and where less so? Do you have any?
Instead of me trying to name states, there are hundreds of abortion restrictions. Go to, there's a website called at the Center for Reproductive Rights that has a map, and you can pick any old kind of restriction you want and see which states mandate ultrasounds, which states have waiting periods, which states mandate have gestational limits, so it's way too complex for me to handle. I can tell you, like, Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas have tons of restrictions. New Mexico and Oregon have very few restrictions.
Okay.
In New York tend to be better than most.
Okay, well, that you did answer that. That's fine. You did answer that question. I mean, that's what I really wondered, was whether the South would be more restrictive than maybe the coasts or something.
I mean, the Midwest also has plenty of abortion.
Yeah. No, that was what I figured.
Ohio's a good safe bet for what state has a restriction.
Interesting. Well, and we can all look up our states and states we've lived in the past. Okay, so I think we have a pretty good idea about what you found. Could you talk a little bit about the reception that your results have received, but maybe to a variety of people, including the professionals and the general public, or what about policymakers? To what extent do you think that you're making a difference, or what would you like to comment about any filters that are being applied to your findings, or what?
So the study has been extremely well received by the scientific community. We have gone through peer review on 51 papers, and we've made it into top medical and sociological journals. So it has scientifically, it has gone through rigorous peer review. The methods are valid, and our findings are strong. Politically, not everyone loves the findings, and then they tend to, rather than is to try and say that the study isn't good. So there's an article in the Journal of Catholic Healthcare that says that the study is no good, but that I don't even know if that's peer reviewed, but in any case, its points are not strong. Just recently, there was an article in Newsweek that tried to equate the study with the early tobacco, you know how early on the tobacco industry funded studies that showed that smoking was great for you. Anyway, they tried to make that equate the study with that, which is absolutely nuts. And some of their metrics of criticism are ridiculous. Like, by their metric, the longer you follow people, the worse the study is, because inevitably you lose some people over time, and they only pick the last, time point of participation rate. So they're just, it's not scientists who are critiquing, it's politically funded advocacy groups. And that is still completely annoying. And it's been hard for me. Like, I want to defend the study, but I also don't particularly want to call attention to what's just, kind of stupid.
Right.
So
Well, yes,
I don't really know how to deal with that, but better, let's talk about impact. The Turnaway study has been cited in many court cases. It's been cited in Supreme Court amicus briefs. It's been used as testimony in Argentina and Chile when they were considering law change, and both successfully changed their laws. I would love to take credit for Korea, but I cannot. Korea liberalized its abortion law, and then only after that they translated my book into Korean. So I cannot claim that my book had anything, because the timing is wrong. But I do love that potentially they're reading the book in Korea.
Right. Okay. All right. Yeah. So I guess there's, it's interesting to me, because in a way, what you're saying with some of these refutations is that people who are very opposed, still in some kind of desperate way, they're trying to use science to refute. So they're going to say, they're not just saying, well, we're just not going to pay any attention. They actually try to find some logical grounds on which to defend their...
I mean, like any scientific study, we lay out the limitations in every article, and we do our best to see the extent to which those limitations actually affect the findings. And we are so transparent about that. We've even published data to analyze how we did our various recruitment. We've been exceedingly transparent. We've worked with scientists from many institutions. So it's not like they've discovered something that we didn't know. We told them, we've given them the basis in our limitation sections for their critiques. And there are things that we are concerned about, but that we've addressed, but that is not, it's political and not scientific. So it's a little hard to refute. And I have been asked, what does your study do for somebody who thinks abortion is wrong? And I don't think it should necessarily change their mind, but it should realize that if they take their idea of what is wrong and put it on other people, there will be serious physical health, socioeconomic, life trajectory hardships for those people, and they need to consider that when they're judging morality and ethics.
Right. Well, so let's project up to you mentioned the Supreme Court, to the Supreme Court's upcoming decision. It is going to be, yes, evaluating whether to reverse Roe versus Wade in this current term. I guess I would love to have you talk a little bit about how you expect that will go. Do you think your research will get quoted at all, and what are your sentiments with respect to the Supreme Court's sensitivity to science?
Well, the previous Supreme Court case, 2 Supreme Court cases back, it was a very different court. Ginsburg was alive, and the Whole Women's Health versus Hellerstedt said you can't just pass restrictions without looking at the data about the impact. That was like the most beautiful moment for scientists. The world has not gotten better since then. And instead, during this last Supreme Court case in December, when it was heard, John Roberts actually said the words, "Let's put the data aside." So I have very low hopes for the Supreme Court actually considering the data on this one. They've got an ideological mission, a religious mission, and I think it's very low chance that Roe versus Wade will survive this next decision. The very best we could hope for is that they don't say that Roe is dead, and instead they just allow all states to ban abortion at 15 weeks. And as we've talked about, that will predominantly hurt people who were using contraception. It'll hurt young people. It'll hurt poor people. But I think the more likely is they'll say Roe is dead, and states you can ban abortion as you see fit, and about half the states will do that. And then we'll have a big mess where lots of people who can afford it travel, and people who can't afford it maybe order pills online, which can be safe if they get the right pills. Some travel to Mexico maybe to get pills there, or Canada maybe. And then many people will carry the pregnancy to term, and the Turnaway study gives us very strong data to show that there will be long-term health and economic effects for families if women are unable to get their wanted abortions.
Well, that's a pretty grim prediction. I guess the thing that I find them particularly disturbing, and there have been other court decisions that go along these lines, where essentially it's going to be the least affluent, the least educated, the least organized amongst us who are going to bear the brunt of this. This is not a problem that is going, I mean, in the past was already the case. I remember when abortion was illegal, and Sherry Finkbein went, I think she went to Sweden. It was a famous case. So, you know, if you have the resources, maybe you won't have to go to Sweden. Maybe you'll only need to go to California or whatever, but just, I'm sure your research shows that, just to be organized enough to consider that an option, and then to have the funds to do it and so forth. And these are women who have other children. And so you can see. How,
or, I mean, and it's going to be particularly hard for minors. Can you imagine being less than 18 and trying to cross state lines to get an abortion elsewhere? It's really hard to imagine how that could be done.
Right. So a lot of other indicators, social problem indicators, and teenage pregnancies, you know, teenage motherhood is all of this is going to go up, at least in the short term. Perhaps in the long term, America will eventually get its act together again and join the modern world. But right now, this is a real step back for American women, and there's little that anyone can say that can put a positive spin on it. Well, I thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Foster. It's just been wonderful to share this information, these facts about the consequences of abortion being denied are much more serious than we had perhaps expected. And the findings should not surprise the roughly 1 in 4 American women who experienced abortion. But because abortion opponents have really been shaming people for so long, most of us didn't know these kinds of things until your study revealed them to us. So we thank you, and our audience thanks you.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's been wonderful to speak with you.
Okay. Going forward, Concerned Citizens anticipates moving to in-person programming. When that happens, instead of featuring our interviews and lectures by remote speakers, we will be videotaping our live speakers and offering their presentations at this time on Village TV and at all times on YouTube. Then again, should we experience another COVID flare-up, Concerned Citizens will return to offering presentations like this one, created by recording speakers remotely on Zoom. Until we meet again, thank you for watching Concerned Citizens Present.